Today is September 7th, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to take some time to speak to parents with young children, especially young parents with young children. I'd like to talk to young parents with young children or any parents with young children who are getting into homeschooling, don't really have much teaching experience, aren't really sure what they should be doing, who might be making some big mistakes. I'd like to talk about a very common mistake, what the cause of this mistake is, and how it can be avoided. One of the biggest problems that I see with many homeschool families is that when parents have young children, they really don't understand how family life and parenting work. They really don't understand how their children's lives are going to develop. They really don't understand the duties of Catholic parents. They really don't understand the independence that children have when they reach adulthood. And they've got a romanticized, fictional vision of what family life is all about. And this leads them to go into parenting, to go into homeschooling, to go into education with unrealistic expectations that turn out to be harmful, not only to their children, but to the parents themselves and to their relationships with their children, possibly their relationships with other family members, maybe even with the church itself. I'd like to really plead with young parents to think carefully about what they're doing and to examine themselves. And I'd like to eventually recommend some helps that I think might be useful in that work of self-examination. Now, just about all Catholics getting into homeschooling, getting into education, went to modern schools themselves. Very few were homeschooled themselves, and if they were homeschooled, they might not have been homeschooled well. And when I say homeschooled well, I don't just mean they had an experience that was better than going to public school or going to a failing Catholic school. I mean, they were actually homeschooled well in an objective and absolute sense, not relative to other options. And so when parents get into education, they often bring their experiences into their homeschooling. They bring their experience in as the only idea, as the only experience that they know of. And what they often do is think back to what their experience was in school. And they think about the good and the bad of their experience, and they say, I'm going to give my children all of the good that I experienced, and I'm also going to take away the bad that I experienced and replace it with good. And that's what I'm going to do. So what they imagine that they're going to offer their children is their modern educational experience on steroids, made better. All the bad taken away and all the good amplified. And so they often double down on modern education rather than learning of alternatives, rather than learning what should be done or what was done historically or what should be done in light of true Christian principles of education. rather than thinking that these are my children. I'm the administrator of my homeschool. We can do whatever I choose to do. Whatever I believe is right and good, that's what we can do. And we're going to set goals and then aim for those goals and follow a path that leads us to those goals. Rather than doing that, they think of what their experience was, and they basically end up doing things at home that are done in modern schools. And this leads to all kinds of problems. The problems start even if a parent is just working with one child and things are pretty simple. The problems start. And I would even say especially when parents are working with only one child, the problems begin. And then when there are more children, the problems amplify and things just begin to fall apart because they're building their homeschool on a really bad idea about what to do. And we deal with parents who do this all the time. We deal with them, I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but we deal with them getting messages, having to deal with these problems probably weekly. And it's always the same things. We can see the red flags immediately. We know exactly what the parents are thinking. We know exactly what the parents are trying to do. We can predict the problems that are going to arise, and when they do arise, it's embarrassing for us to watch the parents try to make excuses or find faults or blame things when we told them what was going to happen if they continued doing what they were doing, and they wouldn't listen. And they imagine that what they're trying to do is right, and as I said, they're going to double down on the errors of modern education, which they're going to actually amplify in their homeschool. So I'd like to talk about this a little bit to try to cut it off at the beginning and help parents understand what the danger is so that they can avoid it, because that's what wise people do. They see evil coming and avoid it. Now, as I mentioned before, most parents are familiar with modern schools. And modern schools are in a lot of trouble for a number of different reasons. And it's important to understand this. First of all, there are public schools. And public schools are not sustainable institutions. Their institution, the structure is not sustainable. Their methods are not sustainable. They do not produce good results relative to the resources that are available to them. You know, it's difficult to keep in mind that if these institutions are given millions and millions and millions of dollars, amazing facilities, and so on, the results relative to the investment, the return on investment, as it were, is very, very low, and really embarrassingly low. What we're investing in public schooling and what we're getting out. It's terrible. So the modern schools are not sustainable. Everything about it is unsustainable. When we look at the schools, we see tons of staff members. We see administrators, office workers, nurses, custodians, teachers, assistant teachers, specialists, therapists, on and on and on. A whole army of staff members, all different kinds of staff members, speech therapists, reading specialists, on and on and on. This is only even possible, this crazy black hole of expenses and overhead costs. It's only possible because it's tax funded. It's only possible because it's tax funded. And it's completely unnecessary. Almost all of it is ineffective and wasteful. It's just the normal government bureaucracy infecting educational institutions. Because there's so much money, we can just continue to hire and hire and hire and hire, just invent unnecessary positions, unnecessary offices, and bill it to the state. And the schools get away with it. Now, the problem with that is that, or one of the problems is that when private schools develop, the private school leaders look at the public schools as the model and imitate what they do. They set themselves up in the same way. They set themselves up trying to build schools that look like the public schools, even though they can't usually. They try to build schools like the public schools. They have all the same programs the public schools have. They try to bring in all the staff members like the public schools have. Same structure, same hierarchy, same organization. And the only way that they can do that is by jacking up the tuition until you basically have a public school education that costs you $10,000 to $20,000 a year. Just a completely unsustainable, unsuccessful system, whether it's public or private. And then the alternative that we find in the private school sector is that there are often small, poorly funded schools that just kind of keep themselves in existence and really do a poor job. They're just not quality schools. And so we've got these three options to choose from: the public schools, the expensive private schools trying to be like public schools, and then the poor private schools which are just struggling to stay alive. That their daily operation is focused on trying to make the school exist. And these are the problems with modern schooling. But that becomes the norm for what everyone thinks about schooling. That becomes the norm. Parents think about, there's a kindergarten teacher, there's an assistant kindergarten teacher, there are preschool teachers, there are, as I mentioned before, reading specialists, speech therapists, all kinds of different specialists and counselors and all these different remedial programs and services and all this kind of stuff. Then we've got the school nurses, and we've got the diagnosis of learning disabilities. If children don't do well in the school environment and they've got problems and they're not doing well, they're not having success, we then begin to look at them and say, oh, well, the symptoms you describe seem to be those of attention deficit disorder, or this problem or that problem, and we can try to solve this by changing the way that you do this, and you can spend time alone with this private reading tutor, and you can have this untimed activity so you don't have the stress of a timed test or this or that. And it's this labyrinth of activities and resources and services and specialists that are all possible. They only exist because there is just such an abundance of resources available because of the public funding. And it creates this world that people begin to think is really necessary for education. And what just baffles me is when we have Christian parents, Catholic parents calling us, emailing us, and they introduce themselves. They're new prospective families. They've just learned about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. They're reading about classical Catholic education. They've almost always got ideas stuck in their head from Dorothy Sayers and all this fake classical education nonsense, which is very easy to discern because they talk about believing in the classical method, which doesn't make any sense. There's no such thing as the classical method. And so we just hear all of this bits and pieces, hodgepodge stuff gathered from all different sources, and then eventually we get to the part of the discussion where we begin hearing about the learning disabilities and the special learning styles and all of this kind of stuff. And these are Christian people who are getting started with homeschooling, and they're just dragging all of this stuff into their home, thinking that this stuff is real, thinking that these needs and these specialists and all of these programs and services and things, thinking that they're all real and necessary for true Christian education. And we sit there and listen as they just go on and on and on, knowing that none of these things are necessary, that the problems are caused by the school model, by the school system, by the school methods themselves. They're caused by the schooling. They're not natural, they're not real. They're caused by the schooling, and they're only true in a modern educational context. Let me give you some examples to prove this, okay? Let's talk about attention deficit disorder. So we have a problem where a child says that he can't, or not a child says, but the child begins to struggle. And when the struggles are communicated or observed by one of the quote-unquote teachers in the school, what becomes apparent is that the student is not going to be able to stick with the clump of students that have been grouped together by their birth date. A student's not going to stick with the curriculum plan, as it were, with the teacher's manual. And so they begin to see that there's going to be some need for, a specialized program. This kid is active, he's hyper, he's not used to this situation or that situation. He's interested in something else. He's not interested in what they're doing in this class. What happens is the schools take what the schools are doing as so real and necessary that if someone isn't interested in it, or if someone isn't served well by it, or if someone doesn't follow the artificial scope and sequence or expected developmental rate of the group, all of which is artificial, all of which is invented by the schools, if someone doesn't follow that, they actually claim that there is a physical or mental or biological problem with the child. And I just want you to think of how crazy this is. The artificial school program is taken so seriously as normal, as the definition of what's normal, that anyone who doesn't succeed in that plan is labeled as a defect, is labeled as disabled. That's how crazy modern education has become. They think that they're so smart, they think they've got everything figured out so perfectly, all scientific and psychological and blah, 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 all of this stuff, that if it doesn't work for you, it's because you are disabled. And therefore you're going to need some special treatment because there's something wrong with you. And that treatment could include giving you drugs that actually change the function of your mind and body. That's how crazy the system has become. And yet, if, as I said, the key thing to think about is that this system, the methods, the scope and sequence, the resources, the arrangement of the school, the way the teachers conduct their classes, the fact that some of these teachers are new teachers with no experience, and yet they're acting like what they do is natural, and if it doesn't work for someone, that individual has problems that need to be fixed. They take it so seriously that if you don't fit into the matrix, as it were, you become labeled as as having problems. And so they begin to prescribe all kinds of remedies, all kinds of individualized actions that need to be taken to fix these problems without acknowledging that what the school is doing is artificial. It can be changed. It's not necessary. And if we look back through history, we see that actually these things were never done. All of the children of a society were never brought to school. It was never assumed that every child should be able to be grouped with other boys and girls born in the same year he or she was, run through a one-size-fits-all educational program that was invented by men who were building assembly lines for automobiles in an attempt to try to socialize and normalize an entire population of diverse people from different countries, different cultures, different religions, different families, on and on, to make of them one universal mutt race and label any outliers as disabled. This was never done in history, never. The whole idea of common schooling, the whole idea of compulsory schooling, the whole idea of taking kids away from their families, away from family members of different ages, and putting them in a single age group with other kids, and then defining what normal is and labeling kids as disabled who don't move at the prescribed pace. That was never done in world history. The idea of public schooling developed in the 1850s, in the late 1800s, and is taken today, or is treated today, as if it is as natural and timeless as the rising and setting of the sun. And this is the insanity of modern education. And if you study history, if you study educational history, I put a bunch of lessons together in a book titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education, which talks about the actual history of education from the ancient world all the way to the present day. And you can see how completely unprecedented any of this stuff is in history. And yet it's taken so seriously by a historically ignorant society that has no idea of what takes place out of this little fishbowl that has been created by social engineers like John Dewey. It's not questioned. No one asks what the alternatives are. No one asks what people did before. How are these things done in the past? We're just fed these myths about education and made to feel like if we don't conform, if we don't do things the way the modern schools do them, we're going to be illiterate, backwards, unsuccessful maniacs who can't live with other people, can't function in society, and so on. And it's all false. It's all false. The problems are coming from the schooling, from the structure of the schools, from the methods of the schools, from the philosophy and goals of compulsory education itself. The whole idea is the cause of these problems. And this was never done in history. And there's nothing wrong with these kids. They're simply being labeled because they don't fit into the cookie cutter that the American educational system and private schools that live in awe of this educational system have adopted as the definition of what's normal and good. And so rather than examining it, rather than stepping away from it, rather than realizing in America we have the freedom to educate our children according to our own ideas and principles and understanding of what they need and how they should be educated and so on, what's best for our individual children. We're free to do that through homeschooling or through private schooling if there is a school that actually serves our convictions and interests. We're free to decide how to educate our own children. We should never allow an educational program or method to be treated as if it's normal. And if our kids don't conform or if our kids don't fit, allow them to be labeled as some kind of defect, to be told that they have a disability because they don't fit into this artificial system of schooling. And yet, we hear it all the time from Christian parents contacting us, just rambling. And the most uncomfortable part about those discussions is that they assume that we think the same way. They assume that we're just on board with all this stuff and, oh yeah, what disability does he have? Oh yeah. And my wife and I just look at each other and say, how does this even happen to Christian people? How does this even happen? If we think of other ways of studying, other ways of learning, especially if we look back into history, these problems just disappear. And let me give you a couple examples. We'll have a student who, let's say, has a hard time paying attention. He doesn't have it's said that he has a short attention span, is hyperactive, right? Doesn't like to, believe it or not, doesn't like to sit in a chair in a school for 8 hours a day, doing things that are, I can remember as a kid sitting in a class while we had, reading lessons where we would be sitting there, 25 kids would be made to sit there while one girl was assigned to read, and we had to sit there and listen to this one girl read, who would be a slow read. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? The classes are boring. The methods are not interesting. It's not stimulating. It's not exciting. It's the activities we do are not helpful. We don't understand why we're doing them or how they help us. It's hard to pay attention because it makes no sense. And yet there's no adjustment. There's no answer. The kids are just treated like they should sit there and sit still and look forward and fold their hands and pay attention and smile, because that's normal. And if you don't feel that way, if you want to fidget around or get up and go for a walk or throw a ball or jump around or do some physical work, you've got problems. And we need to drug you into compliance to make you normal. What if we take that child and change his schedule? What if we bring that child home and say, this boy likes to work, and we as a family have lots of work for him to do. And I have a couple kids who were like this. Kids who liked to work. They liked physical work. And let me just say this. When I talk about this school model, compulsory education, public schooling, not being common in history, almost all children in history were working, not going to school. They were working. If you watch Little House on the Prairie and see all the little kids running to school, all leaving their farms and leaving their families, leaving mom and dad, going to the schoolhouse. Little House on the Prairie, first of all, it's a TV show, so let's be realistic. But secondly, that's late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. That story of Little House on the Prairie is set in late 19th century, or I should say mid to late 19th century America. That's not historical. That's not how it was done in the old days. You're looking at American public schooling there in Little House on the Prairie. You're looking at public schooling. That's not the old-fashioned way. That's not how families lived in the old days. That's modern culture. That's modern American society that you're looking at there. So don't be deceived by TV shows or books, or think that history means 1850. That's modern era. I would go all the way back into the 1700s as modern era. What did kids do all through history? The truth is, they worked. Boys worked with their fathers, or they had apprenticeship arrangements made. Catholic boys might be sent to stay at monasteries. Thomas Aquinas was in a monastery at 5 years old. They weren't in schools like modern school kids. Most kids were working. Think if you know the story of John Bosco, and if you don't, I recommend you watch the movies that are available on the life of St. John Bosco. Notice how his family is working. They're a farm family. They're peasants. They get up every day and they get to work. The sun rises, they get up, they go out to the fields, they work. Everybody works. That's what they do. They're a peasant family. They work. Nobody goes to school from the peasant family. Peasants are workers. John Bosco, as a kid, everyone knows that there's something different about him. He's a gifted kid. He's a grace-filled kid. His mother, who's a devout Catholic, knows he's different. He's not like his older brothers, who are totally content to work all day. John Bosco is different. He has interests that his older brothers and other kids in the neighborhood don't have. He's interested in religion. He's interested in education. He likes to learn, and so on. And so he's introduced to a priest who recognizes these gifts and this interest in studying, and the priest takes him away from his family so that he can be educated and eventually go to seminary, become a priest, and so on. That's how life worked. That's how education worked. Children who are raised, I shouldn't even say children, I should say boys who were born into noble families, where their families, remember, they weren't living in democracies, they weren't living in capitalistic societies where there's just an open market and anyone can just go start a business, choose a career, whatever. No one lived like that. And so the children of noble families, the sons of noble families, they would be prepared and educated with the assumption that they were going to take noble places in society. And this is really what the classical liberal arts were for. They were for the education of noble, future noblemen. That's what they were for. And for learned professions, philosophers, religious professions, and so on. But 90% of the population was working. And this was true into the 1900s. Into the 1900s, most kids were still in fields and factories working all day long. Child labor laws, if you just go Google child labor laws, you'll see that it was like the early 1900s, 1920s, when it finally was made unlawful for kids to work instead of going to school. They were forced. That's why it's called compulsory education. They're forced to go to school. That's a new idea. And the truth is it's harmful for most kids. It's harmful for most kids. And so we face a real difficult situation in our generation, because this idea of compulsory education, if we allow it without examination, we allow it to sort of enter into our thoughts, and we begin to imagine that this is actually real. Compulsory education is actually normal. And we begin to judge our children by their response to compulsory education. And if they don't like learning, and if they don't like sitting, and if they don't like reading, if they don't like algebra, and if they don't like grammar, then they must have a disability, or they must be defects. We've just really become crazy, lost in our own generation, not able to understand our place in history and what's actually real and what's artificial. Now, there are compulsory education laws, so we're challenged to fulfill these laws because it's the law. There's no way around it. But when we talk about laws, this is where people just get crazy. You've got to actually know what the laws are and not just do what other people tell you. You've got to know what the laws actually are. And most homeschooling families, they ask other people what they should do. They ask other people what's required. They ask school programs, homeschool publishers. They ask them, what do I need to do? And they're told by curriculum salespeople what to do. And they go around with all of this hearsay information, imagining that they have to do this and this and that and that. And they don't even know what's true, what's false, what's real, what's artificial. And they live tormented by this lack of understanding, this lack of knowledge of what's actually required. When we talk to parents, we try to help them. We try. We're not very hopeful, but we try to get them to look at the laws directly rather than let other people tell them what the law says. And this is true even of, let's say, a local homeschool evaluator that you have to deal with. That evaluator is not allowed to make up the rules or pretend that his or her preferences or his or her preferred method of education is actually required. It's very difficult. And if you can't handle these kinds of things yourself, you have to get help from people who will actually show you what the requirements are. Not what they want you to do or what they advise, but show you what's actually required, because you have to know what's actually required and what's not. It's very important. Because when you lay down at night and you're thinking about your kid's education and you're anxious or you're concerned about whether you should be doing this or if something's wrong about this or what's that, the only way that you can have true and helpful thoughts is if you actually know what's required and what you might just be tormenting yourself with that's not actually required. You have to be able to discern the difference between those two things. And most of the time, parents that I talk to, they're not doing that. They don't understand how to do that, and they won't listen, even if they're shown directly from the laws that what they're saying or what their friends are saying and what their friends are doing and what this other curriculum salesman is telling them is not true. They don't have the confidence to make decisions freely based on principles. They're too afraid of stepping away from the crowd, and they get themselves into trouble. So, we've got to understand that this modern educational culture and this routine and systems and habits that we see all around us that we may have been raised in, we have to learn that they're not required of us. We're free to educate our own children, and there is compulsory education requirements that we have to satisfy, but we have to make sure that we keep them in their place and we keep them true to the actual laws, and we don't allow this sort of ignorant public interpretation of the rules or hearsay counsel from homeschool salespeople to cause us to think that something needs to be done that doesn't. We also need to know that many of the problems in modern schools that kids are suffering from are caused by the schools. And if we step away from those things, think about what's actually required legally, and then realize how much freedom we have to provide each of our individual kids with an education that's suited to his or her interests, personality, character, and so on, we can actually have a happy experience homeschooling our kids, preparing them for their own vocations, and realizing that not liking school is not a sign that a kid has some kind of disability. Because throughout history, hardly any of the kids even went to school. And it's normal to not go to school. It's abnormal for everyone to be made to go to school from the time they're 5 years old until they're 18. No one ever did that. And so if you have a child, this is really hard. I know this is hard for parents to accept. It's why we have such a hard time communicating it and helping parents. If you have a child, you're a Catholic family, you have children, you immediately start to think that raising saints means raising a bunch of priests, or raising a bunch of religious, or raising a bunch of Catholic scholars or theologians. That's just not realistic. That's not realistic. I don't know where anyone gets that idea from. It's not historical. And we say, oh, well, the Martin family, they had 5 girls who became... Okay, so you're talking about one family, one extraordinarily rare family. That, to be honest, is a bizarre family. If you learn about the mother and father of Saint Therese, the Martin family, they didn't even want to get married. They wanted to be religious, but they had impediments that didn't allow them to enter religious life, and so they decided to marry. They spent the first year of their marriage living in conjugal chastity. They really had no interest in marriage. It was like a religious man and woman married who didn't even want to be married. So their family is an extraordinary, eccentric example. But when we look through history, we see that families were always made up of kids with different interests. John Bosco is a perfect example. We've got this little saint living in the house, this religious zealot who wants to go to school and learn, with these older roughneck brothers who are working out in the field and threatening to, whoop John's butt because he doesn't get out there and help them. And the mother has to always intercede and tell them to leave him alone because he's got his own vocation. Our children are not going to just be these cookie cutter. I don't know where the idea comes from of what it means to be raised like a saint, or what it means to be a faithful Catholic child. It means that you have to be a scholar or you have to be a priest, instead of being a just and courageous and prudent working man or woman. And so when we find our kids, take myself as an example. I'm very intellectual. I work in academics all day long, but I do have interests out on the farm. I grew up in a mechanical family. I like to work on the farm. I like to do physical work. So I'll take my sons out with me, and my wife will be out there. We'll be doing physical work, gardening, building fences. We've run dairy and taken care of cattle and all kinds of livestock. I like to be physical. I like to do mechanical work, but I'm also, listening to Aristotle on my phone while I'm hoeing out in the garden. So I'm a weirdo. I'm the weird one, and it took me a long time to realize that my interests are unusual, that I'm weird, and it's not the people around me are weird and I'm normal. I'm the one who's weird. And so my kids aren't interested in the things I'm interested in, nor do they need to be. They have their own vocations. They've got their own adult lives to live, just as I live an adult life that my parents never had any vision for or didn't raise me for. It's my own adult life. And when we homeschool, we're able to help our children enjoy the best possible upbringing that helps them to be happy and successful and faithful in their own life without any unnecessary distractions or pressures, without any standards that aren't true, without any labels, without being classified as a reject or a defect because they they're not what the school wants at a certain age, we can help our kids to develop individually in their own way while satisfying the legal requirements, and then outside of that, providing them with the best possible education for their own lives. And we don't know what that is. That's something that we study and discover with our children. We learn that with our children. We have to keep them going through the basics of their education, and we help them as they grow up and as their vocation becomes clearer and clearer over time. We help them to specialize at the appropriate time. And let me give you an example, practical, because I don't want to do this nonsense homeschool talk. Let's be practical. My wife and I have no military background. No one in our families, our parents, for example, our own siblings, no military experience. My grandfather was in World War II or the Korean War. My uncle was in Vietnam, but that's it. My wife's family, even less military influence. Never in 1,000 years did I ever think that I would have children and that they would all be interested in military careers. And this manifested itself when they were young, and I didn't understand it. I was confused and frustrated. I was one of these dumb parents thinking that I knew what my kids needed, what I needed to force upon them, and I didn't understand. And I had to learn this the hard way. That's why I can speak from experience. But my kids were interested in being active and physical. They were healthy and strong. They loved to do physical work. They loved exercising and fitness. They were willing to study a little bit. They're willing to study a little bit, especially what they knew was required of them. And as they got older, as they got into their teenage years, they became laser focused on military careers. And I'm not talking one kid or two kids. I have 5 adult children right now. 4 of them are in the military. And even the one who chose not to go in the military, my second daughter, Mary, she works in retail. She's working in management in retail and is as happy as a clam. My wife and I could never have envisioned this. We never could have predicted what our kids would be doing, but they're all doing good things. They're all doing good things, and they all have their own unique relationship to God and to the church, and these things in their own lives are developing, and they're sort of learning who they are, and they're getting experience in the world for themselves in their own unique ways, in their own unique places. And it's just much more complex than I ever imagined it would be. Now, we were able to provide them all, and I'm talking about our oldest 5, our adult children so far. We were able to provide all of them with a great K-12 education, with a high school diploma. And for our kids, all 4 of them, the first 4, all successfully applied to university and were admitted. The eldest 2, my eldest is graduated. My second child is in her senior year. I think she's got like a 3.9 GPA. Successful in college, successful. From a worldly perspective, successful. In my eyes, not what I would have liked them to be or to do. But this is part of the problem with parenting, is that I had to learn that my expectations they belong to my own vocation. They belong to my own unique calling and interest in life, my own unique grace and gifts. And these things are not just assumed to copy down into my children's lives. So I had to learn this the hard way. And of my younger children, again, this is what's so strange. I've still got 5 children at home, homeschooling, ages 9 up to 17. 4 boys and 1 girl. All 5 of them, I should say that the 4 boys, all of them on the path to military careers. And my youngest daughter, Anna, who's 9, she's already threatening me with a military career, telling me she wants to be a medic in the Army. So in God's providence, my wife and I, who have been devoted to Catholic education since we were, or Christian education since we were in college, in some bizarre providence, may end up with 8 or 9 children in the military. We could never have foreseen that. But here's what's really interesting. Looking back, when we look back at their childhood now, we look back, we can see signs from their earliest years that make perfect sense in light of their present occupations and pursuits. We can go back and look at each kid and say, do you remember when he used to do this? Do you remember when she used to do this? Remember when, for example, my daughter Elizabeth, when she was 13 years old, wanted to join the Civil Air Patrol, and I was like, get out of here, you. What in the world are you talking about? You're not a military person. She was interested in that when she was 12, and I dismissed it like it was just, she was just bored looking for something to do, but that turned out to be a sustained interest. Guess what she's doing right now? She just went through testing for flight school in the military. She's doing the same thing almost 10 years later. That was a real sustained interest that at the time seemed ridiculous. My daughter, who chose to go into full-time work, who I said is working in management and retail, she used to love to clean the house when she was a kid. And we used to call her Mary the Worker because she loved to work. She didn't like school. She loved to work. The seeds of their vocations were present in their earliest years. And looking back, we can now connect all the dots and see them. But when we were there as young parents, we had our own ideas of what they should be doing. We had our own ideas of what the culture should be, what the educational standards would be, what our focus should be. But here, the problem was our idea of what everything should be was simply us trying to force our own unique vocation on our kids. And it took time for us because we were first generation Catholics ourselves. It took time for us to understand what was happening, what was going on, why things just felt so strange. Sometimes we felt like our kids weren't even our kids. It's like they had interests that weren't coming from us, and it felt very weird. And it turned out, and especially now as we learn more and more and understand more and more about the parenting relationship, about the duties of parents, about how children relate to God first and their parents second, how God has unique intentions for them and they're equipped for different things and not necessarily to be our helpers or our partners in life. It's easy to talk about that and say it, but it's very hard to actually embrace it and realize it in practice. And so when we look at our kids, we have to realize that the Catechism teaches that they are children of God first and our children second. I'm pledged until death do us part to one person in my life, not my children, but my wife. Again, it took us a long time to really have that sink in. I chose my wife to be with her for my whole life. My wife chose me to be with me for her whole life. Our children did not choose us. We made no vows to our children until death do us part. Our children made no vows to us that they're going to be committed to us, present with us, united to us until death do us part. That's marriage. That's not the relationship between parents and children. And so we have to ask, when we educate our kids, we have to ask, how can we educate our kids for God's service? Or to use a phrase that I usually use, to serve God in the best way possible. And there's just a ton to talk about with respect to this, but I want to make one most significant point here. Most parents who get into homeschooling most parents who get into homeschooling, and I'm not talking about unschooling people because they have other problems, but most parents who get into homeschooling and who end up interested in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, they are intellectually zealous. When they think of the saints, they don't think of Joseph Cupertino, they don't think of Martin de Porres, they don't think of St. Francis. When they think of saints, they think of Thomas Aquinas, St. Dominic, St. Albert the Great, St. Ignatius of Loyola, and so on. They're thinking academic, they're thinking Catholic intellectual life, Catholic intellectual culture, and they're zealous themselves for that learning, which is grace, which is their own vocation. And they think that they're going to install that interest in their children's lives. And when they begin to see disinterest from the children, when they begin to see the children more interested in something else, or more interested in working with their hands, or more interested in this or that, they get frustrated, and what they do is they think they have to get more intense, they have to lock down, they have to be stricter, the schedule has to be tightened up, they've got to get more serious, they've got to remove these distractions, they've got to isolate the kids more, and they go overkill. And so two things happen. These two problems come together that I've mentioned. One is they think in terms of modern education. They double down on modern education as the only way that they're conscious of. Just the K to 12, go to college, academic, get jobs with college degrees, and so on. They take all of that as normal and necessary, and can't think outside of that path as the only path. So they begin to judge their kids as good or bad, successful or unsuccessful, based on how they progress in that unique path. They double down on this modern educational culture instead of letting go of it and realizing it's just one idea about education, just one path. They cling to it more and more firmly and double down on it, as I said. And then secondly, they don't have a right understanding of the reality of our kids' individual vocations, and they try to force their own vocation on their kids. And you know, I know we get this from talk about history. We hear people say things like, well, Jesus was a carpenter. And we say, why would you say Jesus is a carpenter? Oh, because his dad was a carpenter. That means he was a carpenter. No, it doesn't. That doesn't mean that he was a carpenter because his dad was a carpenter. Now in Catholic tradition, it may be true that it's taught that Jesus was in fact a carpenter. But it's not because Joseph was a carpenter. It's because Jesus was a carpenter. And we can go back, and even in biblical examples. I mean, look at Cain and Abel, the first people born into the world. They had different vocations, same parents, same kids, different vocations. So this idea that kids, should be expected to do whatever their parents do, that's total nonsense. Not true at all. Now, it may be where they start. For example, when I was in college, I started working in construction because my dad was an electrical contractor, and so I could easily get jobs in construction, either working with my dad or working with other contractors who were my dad's friends who knew me because of my dad. I could easily get started in work in construction, but as soon as I got into it, I knew that that's not where I was going to stay. And this idea that, we just make copies of ourselves. So if I'm a mechanic, I start a mechanic business, start my own shop, and then I say, I can't wait to have 6 kids so I can have all my boys in the shop with me and they can all take over my business. And no, that's not how it works. They've got their own vocations. And if you try to force them into the service of your vocation, you're going to have problems. And parents do this all the time. So These two common errors that parents make: thinking that the modern school approach, the modern school system, the modern school method is the only way, and doubling down on it, accepting all of the ideas, all of the conclusions, all of the teachings, all of the diagnoses, all of the prescriptions, and imagining that that's really natural and real and not artificial. That's a major problem that modern Christians have. Just reciting all of the modern school talk as if there's no other possible explanation for the kid's behavior other than that he's got some kind of disorder that needs to be dealt with by chemicals. Just craziness. Or that needs to be dealt with by all kinds of expensive state-funded specialists. Like there's no other option. There's no other possible cause of whatever it is that he's struggling with. It's ridiculous, and yet it's very common among Christians. And then secondly, this idea of trying to, or expecting your children to be interested in what you are interested in, to appreciate what you appreciate, to look at the world the way you look at the world, even though you know your experiences are not their experiences. The graces that you've received are not graces that they've received. And yet expecting them to be little carbon copies of you as if that's what makes a person good, which is pretty arrogant if you think about it. You know, if you want to be good, you'll be like me. That's pretty arrogant. And yet it's very common. It's hard for us not to think like that. But it's common. So those two problems, I try to warn parents all the time about these things. There are many different ways to handle the education of your children. I make decisions with my own kids one by one. We use the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, of course, for the foundation of their studies, for their religious education, for classical studies and so on. But as I begin to see their interests and where they're headed and what their future appears to be, when I see them starting to zero in on, let's say, a military career, and I know what the military career requires of them, I know what the recruiters are looking for, I know what the ROTC program is going to want to see, I can start to help to specialize their studies and prepare them specifically for that vocation. I'm not going to stupidly force them to do things that really don't apply to their vocation. I'm going to try to find a healthy balance between the two. I want them to pursue things that are objectively good. I want them to be familiar with the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and Catholic theology and so on. I want them to have good habits. I want them to be initiated into the life of the church. But at the same time, when I begin to see their unique interests becoming clear as they get into their teenage years, I have to help them succeed and prepare for their unique vocation. And so it's always a fluid situation. It's very complicated. We work with them all individually. And what we do with our kids, we have 10 kids, remember. So this isn't some like simple situation we're dealing with here. We have 10 kids, more than most parents in the academy. Normally, we don't stress too much about their early education. We keep them moving. We keep them working. We don't stress a lot about their early education. We just keep them moving forward. And then when they get into their high school years, by like sophomore year, we can start to see where they're headed in life, and we can really start to push them and motivate them to study, not because they're pursuing our goals, but because they can sort of see the finish line for their homeschool studies, their high school studies, and I make it clear to them, like, finishing and getting your diploma, wrapping up your homeschool years, getting your transcript completed, satisfying all the requirements for that destination that you're aiming for, that's your gate. That's your door to your own adult life. And by the time they're 16, 17 years old, they start to see that, they start to understand it, and it's motivating for them to work hard and finish. What I teach my younger kids is that education, I tell them, is like a giant mountain of rocks. It looks like a big, huge mountain, and if you look at it as a mountain, it can be overwhelming and discouraging, and you just don't feel like you want to do anything because it's just so difficult and intimidating. But I say what it really is just a giant rock pile. And what you've got to do is just keep shoveling little bit at a time, just one handful at a time, day by day by day. Keep moving handfuls of rocks, just little handfuls of rocks, what you can carry. And by the time you're 16, 17 years old, you'll have that mountain moved. And you'll be bigger and stronger, and whatever's left for you to finish, you'll be able to blow out in those last 2 years of high school. So as long as you keep moving forward, as long as you're getting things done, making positive progress as you go along, that's good. That's what you should be doing with your education while you're young. And like I said, we've had 5 adult kids grow up, homeschooled, go off to military and college careers successfully. One daughter decided that she doesn't want to go to college. She wants to work full time, go off and immediately start getting promotions and bumped up into a management role, and she's as happy as can be. And that's really what we want, is for the kids to be happy and feel satisfied, at least at this point, with what they're doing in their lives, and then see them sort of establish themselves at that place and then begin to position themselves for whatever comes next. That's really what parenting is about. And homeschooling gives us more flexibility to help and work with our individual kids and really get to know them personally, think about how we can help them individually. And remember too, as our kids come to the end of their homeschool years, when they get to age 18, 19, and they're free to start making adult decisions, we get that last year or so, depending on how far apart your kids are spaced. Ours were between 18 months and 2 years, most of them. You get that last 18 months or so with each of the kids to just focus on that one kid. And so even though they're all just kind of mixed together in a big clump while they're growing up, one by one, you get to spend their last couple of years focusing on them, focusing on helping them transition into their adult vocations. And that last year, 2 years, is a really special time where our relationships with our kids develop as they enter adulthood, and we become part of their adult lives, part of their vocational pursuit. And that relationship is really strong at that point. And we tell our younger kids, just chill out. You're going to have your time. You're going to have your own year or two where you're the focus and you're all we do 24 hours a day, just like we did with the older kids. And that's really where that adult relationship, I think, gets formed, in that last push, in their last couple of years at home, when we help them to identify their vocation, get in touch with the people related to their vocation, help them understand what's required, and then work really hard to help them prepare to succeed and transition to that vocational destination successfully. We've had that with each of our kids. We've got good adult relationships, and we've been able to help them to succeed during those really challenging, difficult years as they move into adulthood. So I know I've talked about a lot, and it's over an hour, so I want to cut this off. And I know that we've also touched on some issues that probably deserve some more treatment, but these are the real challenges. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I'd recommend some resources, and I want to do that. Number one, the Catechism. What I recommend you do as a parent is get the Catechism, go to the section on the 10 Commandments, and find the section on the 4th commandment, which relates to duties of parents and children, and read everything the Catechism teaches on the 4th commandment, honor your father and your mother. Read everything that the church teaches about the relationships of children and parents, the duties of parents to children, the duties of children to parents, because most Catholic parents think wrongly about those things. most Catholic parents think wrongly. They don't actually think according to the teaching of the church on the relationship between parents and kids, and it's very helpful to understand clearly what the church teaches. It's not just helpful, it's freeing. When you understand what your duties actually are, what the relationship is actually supposed to be, it's freeing because you won't be tormented by wrong thoughts about what your relationship with your children should really look like. And many Catholics have just wacky, fictional ideas of family life. So I recommend the Catechism. My wife and I, there's actually an article on the Academy website, if you just search for it, where we went through the duties of Catholic parents. It's like the 27 duties of Catholic parents based on the Catechism. We read through them and discuss them a little bit, and I made sort of a checklist that you can print out from the Academy website. I'll put a link to it in the description on the YouTube channel, but I recommend you read that article, maybe watch that video, and look at that checklist where I list the 27 duties of Catholic parents that are listed in the Catechism. And you can just take some time to sit together with your spouse and go through that checklist and see which of those duties you're fulfilling and are taking care of, and which of them you're neglecting. And realize also how many things that you're worried about or pursuing or stressed about or arguing with the kids about or fighting with your spouse about that aren't even included on that list and really aren't the duties of Catholic parents. So there's a lot to talk about. And as I said, this is a challenging issue, very common, and I think it's good that we get it out on the table as we get ready to start a new school year, and hopefully we can follow up with some questions and discussions that go into more detail, and I'll look forward to emails and comments to help do that. But I wanted to discuss those issues and do so at what I think is an appropriate time. So I hope that's helpful. If there's anything you'd like to talk about or comment on, if you think I'm an idiot and would like to object to something I said, I'd love to hear the feedback. You can write to me privately at wcm@classicalliberalarts.com if you'd like to send me an email, as some do, which is fine. I respond often by making new videos in response to emails I receive, or if you'd just like to comment on the YouTube channel. Realize I'm not going to go back and forth in YouTube comments. They should be brief, and either recommend another topic or recommend that I clarify something or answer another question or respond to an objection, and I'll do that in future talks. But if you'd like to comment in the video, that's a convenient way to get in touch. So hope that's helpful. God bless.